You know, I've been studying for a long time the illicit trade in art and antique from vulnerable countries to the art market countries. And for the last couple of years, I've been focusing more on return issues, maybe to get a bit more into the positive atmosphere. And when I discussed with Wayne the case I would treat, you know, I had several possibilities. First of all, I thought, shall I go and tease the three curators who were speaking before me and take the big Ganesha building, which is at the entrance of the museum, and about which there is enough to say. Another possibility was you know, there is in 15 museums in Europe, there is a collection of South Sudanese objects. And even the curators often do not know that it is there. There are some people in South Sudan who would like to set up a national museum, and they're really making plans for it. UNESCO proves it. But to explain why that should be done in South Sudan at the moment is a bit difficult. So what I opted for is an Indonesian kris, a dagger. But I also said to Wayne, I want to add a question as well. Yes. So the case is about a missing kris, and the question is, are general principles needed to deal with colonial cultural objects? And I'm doing that also to cover, in fact, also the discussion of the three previous speakers. Now, let me start with some good news. Yes. Earlier this year in February, there was a big moment in Jakarta in the National Museum when the descendants of a former Dutch general, Governor General, returned a pilgrim staff. The pilgrim staff was very important because it had belonged to a national hero of Indonesia. The big one, you know, streets are named after him. He has statues and everything. And they were extremely happy with it. And the staff was 200 years old on the left side. On the picture, the director of the National Museum is signing the agreement with these two descendants. And Diponegoro had lost it in the battle, in the big Java War, 1825-1830, in which 200,000 on the Indonesian side had been killed. And since the grandfather or something, he had purchased, it had been donated to him in the past. And at a certain moment, these people, they thought, no. You know, they said over time and between the different generations, the real significance of the staff was lost for the family, and Indonesia needs it much more. So I think that's a very positive example. And the only thing which I want to say, and that's also relevant for Pim's story about the Nusantara collection, it went to the National Museum, whereas inside Indonesia, there's a big debate between regional museums who want to do their own things and the national museums. And I know that the Bout family, they also visited the Diponegoro Museum in a small village in Java, and they also would have been interested in getting the staff. But that's maybe for the discussion. Now, the missing kris is another story. I have no picture of it, obviously, and it's a bit of a mystery. You know, it was at the end of the Java War, Diponegoro, who was the main leader of the war on the side of the Indonesians, he had to surrender his weapons. His main weapon was the dagger, the kris. And the kris, we guess it must have come to the Netherlands, and it was part of the discussions between the Dutch government and the Indonesian government on the return of cultural objects. And in these, in the joint recommendations which they reached in 1975, it was said that you can read with regard to objects of historical emotional value, such as those belong to Diponegoro, the Dutch government be willing to find the ways for their transfer to Indonesia. But it's still missing, and nobody knows what it is. And maybe it's in a private collection, but in the same recommendations, it says that, you know, non-state objects, non-state-owned objects, The Dutch government rendered assistance within the limits of its competence in establishing the necessary contacts. It never did anything to do so. And you see that an exception of the previous one, this Bout family with the pilgrim staff, they did it, but the others never did it. So then, you know, many people have been looking for the Kris. I'm not the only one. You know, you can look for it in Vienna. It's not there. You can look for it in the city of Arnhem, in the city of Leiden here. It could be here, you know, at a few meters from here, from where we sit. It could be in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And sometimes there are indications that it still is here. For instance, in the archives of the Foreign Ministry, there is a coded telegram out of 1983, which says that the Kris is in the cellars of the Rijksmuseum. And the interesting thing about the pilgrim staff is that the Rijksmuseum was mediating between the family and the National Museum in Jakarta, but is not, and that was a private property, but is not researching, is not problematizing its own collection, and not really searching for it. And you know, and thinking about this, and also like about what Annette was just telling about the Benin dialogue, I had discussions with Barbara Plankensteiner from the Vienna Museum, who initiated this dialogue. And I was talking about the Washington principles, the Washington Conference principles to deal with restitution of Nazi-looted art. And I said, would it not be useful to have something like that for colonial cultural objects? And she said, yeah, because sometimes we feel like we are swimming. You know, we don't know really what to do, how hard to work for it. And it would be good if there would be some general lines which can guide us to do so. So what I've done is I've translated these Washington principles for principles, and then I say, I've distributed it, you've got this magazine, huh? And I've called, you know, the Washington principles are for Nazi confiscated art, which is a very limited definition. I'm speaking about principles on objects of cultural or historical importance taken without just compensation or involuntarily lost in the European colonial era. So I've adjusted these principles for it, and I think see that. And I've taken a few things from it. I mean, it's too much now to deal with all of it, but it's the Washington principles, it's also the Vilnius principles, but for instance, also the German Museum Association has recently come with new guidelines for dealing with colonial human remains. And one of the articles in the guidelines is that museums and heritage institutions, they should actively look for things, you know, which should not be in their possession and which they should discuss with them. So, you know, I have to wrap up, that's no problem. But what my question to you is really, because I've not made up my mind whether, you know, to do it or not. I'm doing a PhD with Suzanne Lejeune, who was here yesterday, on return issues. And I have to make up my mind whether it is useful to formulate such general guidelines for dealing with return matters of colonial cultural objects. And I'm not really sure what to do. And maybe some of you have suggestions for me. I will leave it to that then.